Welcome everyone to another CTC software webinar. My name is Sean Zerbis. I'm the Director of BIM Development here at CTC Software, and in today's session, we're going to be talking live here about how you can update your scheduled data refreshes, right? We're continuing this CTC Analytics Learning Series. This is the part 4 of the Web API part of this Analytics Learning Series. So, as usual, of course, these webinars are being recorded. This webinar is being recorded. And also, as usual, we try to answer questions live throughout the webinar. So if you have questions on today's content, we encourage you to throw it. If you're participating with us live here in the webinar, put it into the QA part of the GoToWebinar system. And if you're viewing this on YouTube, fantastic. Feel free to throw questions in there too. We try to keep an eye on those and get those answered. Or you can, of course, reach out to us directly as well, and we'll walk you through some of the answers to your questions. Without further ado, let's jump into today's topic a bit more in depth. So in reality, here in the world, information, data is really king. I mean, cash is king in some cases, but data is important because it helps you get to that. Having the right information is really important. Having the information and having the ability to make decisions based on that data also can really make you a force to be reckoned with. It can empower you to be significantly more productive. It can help you direct spending efforts at your firm. It can help you make choices about a lot of different aspects of business. So data is really, really important. In the previous parts, part 3 of this little subsection of this series, we focused on how to establish and populate a SQL database so that you can keep your data. Instead of having this data only exist in Excel and only exist for about 30 days, with the SQL database portion, we can now keep a ton of historic data and really control how that is being populated. In this session, we're going to shift gears just a little bit. We're going to continue to talk about SQL databases, but in this part 4, we're going to build on all the skills we've developed throughout this series, and we're going to build up an automated data refresh system. And the purpose of this is so that you don't have to manually interact with the code anymore. You can just say every day or once a week or whatever frequency you want, you can have this refresh. So we're going to be leveraging the reporting API that we've been leveraging. We're going to continue to leverage Python, but we're also now going to leverage a task scheduler that we've all got on our systems to ensure a regular and rapid update of your local database. And this way, when you go ask for information, it will be as up to date as that refresh has been, and it'll be really simple. Now, hopefully by the end of this, you'll be confident in using Python and the reporting API and effectively that task scheduler to keep your data up to date. So we're going to dig in pretty deep here. We're going to talk about 4 specific things. We're going to develop a strategy for updating. This is, we're going to talk about what needs to be updated and some things that you're going to want to consider. So in case you want to modify this for your own purposes, you'll have some ideas to where that's coming from. We are going to implement the ability to schedule refreshing. We're going to talk about what that looks like. Then we're going to actually establish it. We're going to establish refresh scheduling. And then we're going to verify, of course, that our data is populating the database as we would expect it to. So we'll be going through those particular steps today. Now, before I go too deep, let's just talk about where we've been. Let's talk about this series roadmap and where it's going. So we have all these topics here. Installing and configuring the project activity logger. It's a portion of the data collection system for projects within Revit that allows you to log data. We talked about how to get that set up. We talked about organizing some of that data within the CTC portal. We took a look at some portal dashboards so you could get early access to this. We started a little bit with the reporting API and just took a quick look at like how is it structured and how do you interact with it a little bit. In the major part 1 of the Web API series, we actually did some custom reporting via Microsoft Excel and Power BI. In part 2, we began using Python to harvest JSON just to kind of get the idea of how that looks. In part 3, which was our last session, we used the Python to store the data in the SQL Server. And now, today, we are at this last portion here where we're going to be using the Web API. We're going to do some automatic data refreshing going directly to that same SQL database we already set up. Okay. Normally at this point, I would usually jump into some prerequisites. But this is part 8 of this series. If y'all don't know the prerequisites by now, I'm going to encourage you to go back and rewatch some of those previous parts to get caught up to where we are, because we're in sort of the final closeout stages here, and I think you probably already have the prereqs in place. And if you don't, you got a bunch of work to do anyway to get that set up. So take a look, not a bunch of work. You have a little bit of effort to go get the stuff and get it set up. So go review those previous webinars if that's the case. But right now, we're going to jump in and talk about an update strategy, that first major part. What does it take to actually update data? And the answer to that is it depends. It depends on what kind of data it is, and it depends on how it is expected to be updated. What does it mean to update something? So there's a couple of different kinds of records that exist in different tables. The first one that I'm going to talk about here is updatable records. We call this mutable data, stuff that changes, stuff that mutates over time and changes. For this, what we want to do for an update strategy is compare that item, get that item, and compare the last version to the updated API version. And if the API record is newer, then we simply overwrite. We replace the data in the old record and potentially go fetch some additional details for that and continue to overwrite that data. So that's updating an existing record that is expected to change. Where would this exist? Well, this primarily exists in project definitions from the project activity logger portion, where you might change, say, a delivery date on the project, or you might add additional paths to the project. So that would be a changeable record. Content records within the CMS, those items can change over time. You may process into the CMS a new piece of content, a file, and then in the future you make an update to that, you reprocess that same piece of content. The original data, as far as who added it, is the same, but the updated at and updated by data might be different, and then the actual content files might be updated and the properties might be updated. So that content record is like a mutable piece of data. Library definitions, tag definitions, all mutable data. So there's also data where there's really only new records, where the data that's in the database is immutable. And for this, all we need to know is what is the last record, what is its date, and then add anything from that point forward. This would be stuff like new app sessions. So a user starts up a CTC tool, that creates a data log. It says how long they were in that tool. You can use that to understand CTC usage from the cloud shared licensing portion, the CSL portion of the actual API. Information like searches in the CMS. A search in the CMS is something that never changes. Once you run that search, it's been run. So only new records really need to be updated. Another good example of that might be in the project activity logger. Once an app session, when somebody's in Revit, they're running Revit, they have a project open, and that data has been logged, that data record never changes after that point. It's done, it's logged. And then all you're getting is new records on into the future. So once we get this, we don't have to fetch the last 30 days of stuff. We can potentially fetch the last 1 day of stuff, and the data fetch becomes significantly faster at that point because I'm only fetching as much as I need. So this way you're updating, the first data pull might take a while because we're getting everything from a certain amount of time. And then from that point forward, we're just getting new stuff and change stuff, and that can be a lot faster. Now there's a third kind of record and a different kind of update strategy. There are in the data set relational records. A relational record is something where like a piece of content from the CMS has a tag on it. And you can change those tags, the relationships of those tags over time. This isn't the actual content record or the tag record that's changing. It's just, does this content actually associate with this tag, or is it a part of this library? Or in the case of, say, licensing rights, right? In the cloud shared licensing aspect, you may have a CTC BIM project suite license, And maybe you've allowed everyone to have access to that license. That's great. Well, who is everyone? Who is in that everyone group? So that group association, you can actually ask the group record, who is in this group? And that's going to change over time. So those relational records, they may change, they will change. And for that, what we're going to do is simply delete all related records and replace them with the latest and greatest data. So when you fetch, you'll need to consider that and fetch the most efficient one for that process. So some of these have been implemented in my latest data set. Some of them have not. We'll talk about that a little bit later on as to how you can get this to be much more efficient. So the next thing we want to talk about is how do we implement sort of a refresh ability into this system. So far, we've been just running the data directly in whatever your code editor is. You just run it manually. Well, there's a better way. Now, we talked about in one of our earlier parts, actually way back in part 2 of this little mini series here, we talked about establishing a virtual environment. And we're going to leverage that virtual environment. In fact, when you create a virtual environment within Python, it automatically puts a Python executable right there in that virtual environment folder. In that scripts folder, there's a Python executable. If we use that, any executable, or not any, but many executables, they often have the ability to pass a parameter to it, a thing to it, a switch. And what we're going to pass to it is the running of the main.py, the thing that we've been doing manually within the IDE. We run it, the integrated development environment. We run it. Instead, we're going to write a little script that is going to say, take that virtual environment Python executable and pass to it the main.py. I'll show you exactly what this looks like, so you'll see where this is in the latest GitHub data refresh. So what we're going to do is package this in a .bat file. There's other ways to do this. I'm just doing this in the most simplistic way so that anybody can achieve this. If you have a more involved technique that you'd like to do to run this, absolutely fine. I'm going to show an example today where it's really simple. It's just simple text files. We're not building an actual executable of our own. We could do that, but that makes it more complicated, and I like things to be a little more simple. So we're just going to package this up in a traditional, like old school script, just a .bat file. And once it's there, we can just run the .bat interactively if we want to. We could run the BAT file every time we log into Windows. We could run that BAT on log out so that it does a thing. There's a lot of things we can do with this, but what we're going to do is we're going to tell this to refresh on a predictable schedule. That's going to be our step. And what we're going to do to refresh on a schedule is we're going to use the Windows task scheduler. Since we're already most likely running in Windows, since we're dealing with Revit data, most of us doing this will be interacting with Revit, and for that you need Windows. We will be using the Windows task scheduler. Now again, if you were using this on, say, a Raspberry Pi, you could write a different methodology for scheduling this. You could write a bash script or something. If you were running this on Mac, you could do something different, right? So there's different ways of doing this, but for my example today, I'm going to use Windows Task Scheduler since, again, most of us are probably using Windows. What I like to do within the task scheduler is I'm going to create a folder for scheduled automations. I do this so that I can keep myself organized. And what we're going to do is tell that scheduled task to run the .bat file at whatever interval we want. So far, I've all been in PowerPoint. Now I'm going to start transitioning over to a little bit of the code, and we're going to take a look at what this looks like, okay? So we're going to start with the whole building up of the .bat file and see kind of what this means. So I'm going to access here my Visual Studio environment. I'm going to close a couple of things down that I don't necessarily need open right now. And we're going to go jump over here to the terminal and just kind of take a look at what's going on. Before you run main.py in this environment here, you need to make sure that you've activated the proper virtual environment. We did this, I think, back in part 2 of this little portion of the mini series here. we built up a virtual environment over here, and that gives us a series of folders. Most importantly in here, it gives us a set of dependencies that we're using. We can keep those up to date by simply pip installing those packages. And we've already done that to get this code to work in the first place. But within here as well, normally when I'm here at the terminal command line, I would run something like, what is it here? Python, so Python, I think it's Python. Nope, it's, I'm just running the actual folder. It's venv / scripts / activate. And what this does is it activates the virtual environment, right? So I'm just typing this out. I'm basically running a file that exists inside of here, and it lets me know that I'm in the virtual environment, whatever I called it, because of this little prefixed green thing. And then if I was to run this script here, it would do all the things it's supposed to do and use all the code that I've written so far to do everything, because it's going to depend on the stuff that's in this virtual environment folder and making sure that it has access to those site packages and access to other scripting items inside of here, right? That's just what Python natively does when you have that virtual environment active, and in this case, Visual Studio as well, Visual Studio Code. So, but to do this on more of a scripted basis, really what this is doing when you're in a virtual environment is, yes, it's creating that little environment for the site packages, but when you run your code, this virtual environment tells the integrated development environment, the IDE, to, hey, go into scripts and make sure you're using this Python executable right here. Use this and pass to it whatever script, whatever module you're building here, pass that to it and run that executable with this .py file. So we can do that. I could tell this, instead of me typing all of this, doing this and like running a bunch of stuff, I can simply say now python.executable, because I'm in the virtual environment, it knows to use this one, space main.py. And it will run this and do the update. I'm not going to do that because I want to actually show that it's going to do an update here in a minute, but it would run that directly. If I wasn't here in the IDE at a command line, what I would do is just make sure I was in this folder, and then I would type out specifically venv scripts Python. Typically that would be .exe, but you don't have to put that part. It assumes that, space main.py. It's the exact same thing. I wouldn't have had to call up the virtual environment. I wouldn't have had to do this first inside of here. This is just a convenience factor so that I don't have to keep typing this out every single time I run. And the environment here, the terminal, knows what it's supposed to be doing. So if I just took this directly and put this into a .bat file, that would work. As long as I'm calling up wherever my repository is, wherever this data set is with this code in it, and I call this up, it'll run. So I have already put this in here. In fact, if you refresh the data set, you'll get access to the automatic run.bat, and all you're going to want to do is make sure you update the call directory here, the CD, so that this goes to wherever you've put your repositories. A lot of your stuff by default is going to go behind your username, and so you're going to want to update this path right here. But you'll notice that the next command down is all it's doing is running virtual environment scripts python.executable, that's assumed, and it's running main.py. So it's running this. That's what this automatic run.bat is. If I run this right now, it'll do exactly the same thing it would normally do if I just hit F5 inside of the IDE, but the IDE itself doesn't have to be open. So that's key. This is how we're going to set this up to refresh on a schedule. We're going to use this automatic run.bat file right here. Now, in addition to that, we're going to be using, as I mentioned before, Windows Task Scheduler here. Now, in the Task Scheduler, I mentioned that you're going to right-click, you're going to build a brand new folder. You're going to call this like reporting refresh. I misspelled that. That's glorious. That's fun. Let's rename that to make it correct. I can't do that. That's fine. We'll just delete that for now because I've already got one right here. It's called database. And in database, so I right-clicked and I had done the new folder. I typed it out correctly the first time. The last time I did this, it's called database here. And in database, over here to the right, I right-clicked and created a basic task. So you just build up a basic task. You're going to give it some kind of a name. Mine in this case is Refresh Reporting API database, something like that. And here I can give it whatever name I want. So auto refresh of reporting DB, whatever, doesn't matter. You can call it whatever you want it to be. You can give it some kind of a description. This refreshes the CTC software reporting database, data pull from Python, whatever, going to X database. You can call out whatever you want here for this. In this case, I'm just going to click next, and then you can choose how frequently you want this to run. Does this run every day? Does this run weekly? In the weekly, there's actually going to be some options for what days in the week do you want it to run on. Do you want it to run monthly, like first Friday or first Monday of every week, whatever? You could do that if you wanted to schedule that, or just a one-time run, or every time you log on or log out, or whatever. There's a lot of things. When somebody, sends you an email, do you want it to refresh? Like, there's events you can actually log. If Windows does a Windows update, do a data refresh. There's a lot of things you can do with the cool task scheduler here. I simply set this up to run weekly for myself. And in the weekly, I said run Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and maybe I do it on a Friday too. But that's up to you. You can tell it when to start this series. It'll go forever after you start this. You can tell it to run every 1 week or every 3 weeks or whatever you want there. You can tell it a time in the day to run, and then it will do the thing. And then the next step here is to choose what the action is. So I just told it to start a program. And if I click next here, it's going to ask me, okay, well, what is the script that you want to do to start that program? And all I did was give it this automatic run.bat. So I browsed to that. No, I can't drag and drop it from here. That's fine. I just browsed to that and told it what to do. So if I go browse here and I say, hey, go get me my repos, my code, my reporting API here for the webinar, I go grab the virtual environment, the scripts, and not the scripts, that's wrong. It was automatic run.bat. So I just gave it that .bat file that I have in that environment. And if there's extra arguments I need, I can do that. I could do some things where I force it to run as admin. There's a lot of things that you could do with this task scheduler, but ultimately, when I click finish, it'll build this task. Now, I'm not going to do this building of the task because I've already got one right here. I'll just show you exactly what my settings are. So in here, my general settings, I've told this to only run if I'm actually logged on. So when I leave at the end of the day, I Windows L lock my computer and I just leave it on. I have all my programs shut down, but I leave it running. It runs with the highest privileges. Because I have local admin rights, it runs with local admin rights. I don't need this. I just, on habit, for all the things that I have scheduled, a lot of the items that I do require admin rights, so that's just a habit for me. And I tell it to run sort of hidden so that it doesn't actually show any of the background code doing a thing. It does show the bat window, but that's it. The trigger here is it runs for me every day of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, at 5:15 p.m. That's typically, I'm out of the office by then, 5:15 p.m. Central, so it looks at my computer time, and it runs every day and just keeps my data up to date and refreshes every single time. Once again, the action is it starts a program, it runs that .bat file, and there really are no major conditions other than I only tell it to start this if the computer is on actual plugged-in power. I have a laptop, and if I was running on battery, I may not want this to run. So I told this to run as long as it's on AC power, and I did tell it if the computer has gone to sleep, because sometimes, if I lock and maybe I'm out of the office for a day for whatever reason, my computer's still here, it's still turned on. If it's asleep, this will actually wake the computer up, force it to run this refresh, and then it'll let it go back to sleep when it's done. And so it runs this also on demand if I want to, which is something I'm going to do today. If it runs longer than 8 hours, I've told it to stop it. So if something went wrong and it's just hung up on something, I force it to stop, and then I go take a look at the logging later on. Force it to stop if for some reason it won't. It's just a bat file. It should definitely stop. And then it'll also give me the history of when it was run, how many times it was run. This takes a minute for it to pull this up, but you can see this has been run a lot of times. This automatically triggers based on that schedule. There's a couple of times when I intentionally triggered it. and I'll do that again today here. But normally this thing just runs on some kind of a schedule and continues to do what it's supposed to do. Okay, so before I actually force this to run right now, let's go take a look and actually verify that data is actually going to refresh. So how do I verify that data is going to refresh? Well, first of all, you're going to use whatever your SQL IDE is. In my case, it's going to be SQL Server Management Studio. And within that IDE, I'm going to run a specific command. I'm going to select everything, specifically from core.refreshed, and I'm going to order it by the refresh start date at, that's a field, that's a column in that table, and I'm going to sort it descending so that my newest refresh shows up right at the top. And then for any other tables that you're interested in pulling data on, you can do a similar kind of query for other tables. Select everything from, say, csl.appsessions, order by started at, I believe is the name of the field in that particular table. You can always take a look at your data and find that out, but you can order by that and then just kind of see what the latest and greatest data is. What I have today here is I have, and actually I should just probably pop that forward. Yeah, order by relevant dates. So you can see the data being refreshed as this takes place. So in my IDE here, if I hit F5 on this little top script, I'm selecting everything from core refreshed. I'm selecting everything from CMS, that's the content management system searches, and I'm ordering it by searched at. So my latest searched here shows up at the top of the list. This is showing 5/14, so effectively yesterday at 4 o'clock approximately, there was a search that was run. And then also here, select everything, in this case, top 1,000 actually. I don't have to have everything. So top 1,000 from csl.appsessions. And again, I'm ordering by that started at. This is the one that I mentioned a little bit ago. And I'm also selecting here, I had an extra selection for a particular refresh ID. I'm going to get rid of that because that's not relevant for what we're talking about right now. So it's just these three that will show up. So if I hit F5 here, I'll see that my last refresh ran at 11:15 today because, of course, I tested this today before I actually was going to do this in the session. And you can see it takes just under a minute to refresh, right around a minute for most of these refreshes. There's a few in here when I was doing some updating of my code earlier where it was not finishing. And so you'll know it didn't finish because it shows a finished at as null. And of course, the duration then is nothing as well. So you'll see if there was a problem in here if it never finished the data refresh. Might have gotten some data, but you didn't necessarily get all of the data, right? Within the tables themselves, I'll see exactly what is in here. And so I can find that out. So if I hit F5 here, you can see, once again, my last refresh was 5:15 at 11:14 Central Time today. This is being stored in Central Time right now. And over here, my last searched at was 5:14. And if I was to scroll to the, oh, right here, it's in the middle, 5:15, actually, there was some app sessions from today. This is in UTC, Universal Time. So this is 3:52. So we're in Central Time, so -5 on that, 5 hours ago. That would be like 11:52, 10:52 probably is when that was. So we're going to try a refresh right now. We're going to try this from the scheduled task environment so that it just runs, and we're going to see what happens. So tonight at 5:15, it's going to run again, but I'm going to force a refresh right now. I'm going to right-click. I'm going to do a run. Doing this live here, this pops up on my other monitor, this little bat file script routine that's running in sort of a DOS prompt, because that's what .bat files do, is they run like that. Over here, if I hit F5, we have a new refreshed, and it's doing a refresh right now. It's actively running that refresh. Now, it's going to take however long it takes, probably right around a minute. And so if I keep hitting F5 here, we'll actually see some data probably showing up here eventually in this list that's newer. Yeah, there's some actual new started at, actually, no, that one's still the original one. So we'll see if this finishes here. And ultimately, when this finishes, this should show me a refreshed finished at and a refreshed duration in minutes when this is all done. Okay, so we'll let that pull. That usually takes right around a minute. We'll come back to that a little later on, perhaps. So that's how that can run. This is actually pretty simple to get this set up. The whole setting up of the Windows scheduled task item over here, right there, the Windows Task Scheduler, and just telling it to run the .bat file once you know that works, that's the most complicated thing today, is getting the bat, getting it set up, telling it to run correctly, and then letting it do what it's supposed to do for the data refresh. So we've already talked about verifying that data. Let's talk here about where we are in the series roadmap, and then we're going to talk about some next steps. So we've already covered the first 7 major parts of this series. Today, we just finished up using the Web API Part 4 to do some automatic data refreshes in SQL. We're actually not using the Web API. We're using a Windows Task Scheduler in this case. And so at this point, this whole series is effectively complete. However, for those of you who want to do a bit more, there are some next steps. There are some things you're probably going to care about because code is never technically done. There's always going to be improvements. So what are the next steps for you, and for that matter, for me on this data set? Well, first of all, I am going to continue to update my GitHub repository. So for those of you who are interested in using what I've already written and you want to get the latest and greatest stuff, make sure you get GitHub Desktop. We've talked about that in previous sessions as a prerequisite. Get that, get hooked up to my repository, and begin to, on some regular interval, refresh it. I typically make major improvements weekly. Typically, I've been doing it on Mondays, and actually last week and a lot of the previous weeks, I've been doing it nearly daily. But I will be trying to get major updates done in there generally on a weekly basis. The nice thing is that once you have this set up, your next steps is making sure you've got this set up. Once you have this set up, you can start asking the data set questions that you want to know the answers to for things like, how are my team using CTC Software's tools? What kind of things are happening in my Revit project environment for that PAL data? What users and groups do I have set up? Who's got what rights? There's a lot of questions you can begin asking the data. Now, personally, I recommend building your questions, building your reports, and getting your answers back in a tool like Microsoft Power BI. That's a much easier way in a lot of cases of visualizing your data. Now, you can certainly do this in SQL. Absolutely, you can do that. There's a lot of power SQL has, but you got to get good at SQL to do that. But if you just start using something like Power BI, you can pull the data in to Power BI from your SQL database, whatever database style it is you're using, you can pull that in. Now, my repo today, my repository in GitHub today does not have a starter Power BI file that is hooked up to SQL Server. Currently today, my Power BI file from the earlier sessions is still tied in with Excel. I am going to be improving upon my Power BI file. It will be talking to SQL servers, and you will be able to get that if you do that sort of first step, check back weekly. Now, how fast I get things done and what I end up doing and what CTC developers end up doing from a data point of view depends a lot on you. So, if you are interested in specific data, please let CTC know, let CTC Software know, let me know about your interest in using this data, and let us know more of what you're interested in, because more of what you're interested in is more where we're going to be expanding the capabilities. And also, if it's something like, hey, Sean, I really want that Power BI file that talks to SQL, great. Let me know that, because that puts some kind of urgency for me to focus on that sooner than focusing on, say, commenting in all of my code, right? So we're always interested in what it is you have interest in. Let us know what you'd like to know more about this data. With that, I'm going to say an initial thank you. This is for the recording purposes. Thank you to all of you who are, participated with us live, but also thank you to those of you watching this on YouTube. We hope that throughout this series, you've got a lot of value. We hope that this helps you better leverage the CTC Reporting API, and just in general, helps you expand your knowledge set and advance your skills working with data in general, web APIs in general. It goes beyond just CTC's data once you've picked up some of these skills.